Imagine a life story that just seems full of contradictions. You have a child born into, well, extreme poverty, fatherless, bullied, beaten even. And somehow, this same person rises to rule an entire nation, as that's the story of Saddam Hussein. Nearly 20 years after his death, his influence, his shadow, it still looms large over the Middle East and, really, the world. So the question is, how does a boy who apparently used a steel rod to defend himself become this figure, seen by some as a hero, by others as, an absolute tyrant? Today, we're doing a deep dive, trying to cut through some of the noise and give you the essential story, the key insights into this really complex figure who shaped so much of modern history.
Absolutely. And our mission here is really to trace that incredible journey, from those unlikely beginnings through his climb to absolute power, his often brutal reign, and then, of course, his dramatic fall. We've looked at a range of sources to kind of pull out the crucial events, what they really meant, their implications, trying to give you that full picture without it being, overwhelming. It's a story that's just steeped in power, betrayal, and this incredible, almost stubborn defiance right to the end. As we go through it, maybe think about what drives someone to conquer a nation, only to, lose it all in the end.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning. His earliest years. We're talking Halabja, a small village in Iraq back in 1937. Picture it. Deep poverty. His father already dead before he was even born. And his mother, apparently so devastated, the sources say she tried to end her life before he arrived. That's the foundation. It's kind of staggering, isn't it, how a child with literally nothing, no dad, no money, no status, could end up leading a country. And the sources mentioned he was bullied relentlessly as a kid. But what's interesting is his reaction. He supposedly carried a steel rod, not just to defend himself, but apparently to, smash back against anyone who mocked him, refused to back down even at 10.
Right. And that age, 10, is pretty significant because that's when, apparently because his stepfather was so cruel, he runs away. He flees to his uncle. Now, this uncle wasn't just any relative. He was a revolutionary figure connected to Iraq's early Ba'ath Party, the pan-Arab socialist movement pushing for unity and independence. So that connection, it's huge. It actively planted those seeds of political ambition, that revolutionary mindset in young Saddam. By his teens, he's in the party. And then, get this, at 22, he's part of this incredibly bold mission, assassinating Iraq's prime minister. He reportedly just unloads his weapon into the convoy fearlessly. The mission failed, obviously, but that sheer audacity, it forced him to flee to Egypt. And here's a fascinating detail the sources bring up. Even then, as this sort of unknown failed assassin, he apparently caught the eye of bigger players, like the CIA. It kind of hints at that whole Cold War dynamic, doesn't it? Superpowers looking for potential assets, even rough ones, in unstable regions.
Yeah, that's a really interesting wrinkle. So he eventually returns to Iraq in the 1960s. And the sources say he's, transformed, a different person. And when the Ba'ath Party takes power, his rise is just incredibly fast. By the time he's 30, he's essentially the second most powerful man in Iraq, which tells you something, doesn't it, about his cunning, his ruthlessness, his ambition. And it wasn't just luck. He starts making big moves, nationalizing Iraq's oil, basically kicking Britain's economic grip out, plus spearheading modernization, bringing electricity to villages, setting up free schools, free hospitals, building up the economy, to the point where by 1979, one Iraqi dinar was apparently worth $3, which is pretty amazing. So for many Iraqis, especially early on, he looked like a real hero, a builder. But you have to ask, what was the trade-off? What was the cost in terms of freedom?
And it's fascinating where he supposedly drew inspiration from. The sources mention an obsession with the movie The Godfather.
Well,
apparently, he consciously modeled himself on Don Corleone's. The suits, the cigar, that kind of calculated menace. He adopted that persona.
Wow. Life imitating art in a really dark way.
Exactly. It gives you a weird insight into his mindset, maybe. And by 1979, he makes his move. He forces out Iraq's president. The command was apparently just chillingly simple: resign and go home. And that, right there, that's the real beginning of his reign of fear.
And it didn't take long for him to show what that meant. Just 6 days after taking power, he calls this meeting infamous. Lights a cigar, apparently, stares down the Ba'ath Party members. And then, one by one, he starts naming names, accusing 68 of them of treason. Can you imagine the fear in that room? Some were let out quietly, others literally dragged away.
And the outcome was brutal.
Brutal, half jailed, half executed. The ones who survived, they start chanting his name out of fear, loyalty, probably a mix of both.
A terrifying display.
Yeah, it set the tone immediately. Rule through absolute terror.
But that kind of absolute power at home, it seemed to lead pretty quickly to his first major catastrophic mistake on the world stage. So
Mhm.
1979, you also have the Iranian Revolution. Ayatollah Khomeini, a Shia leader, comes to power in neighboring Iran. This was huge. It sparked revolutionary feelings across the Arab world, especially in Iraq, where most people are Shia Muslim. Saddam, though, he's Sunni, and he saw Khomeini and the Shia revivalism as a direct threat to his own rule, to his Sunni-led government, his secular Ba'athist state.
Right, a fundamental ideological clash, basically, and a perceived threat to his grip on power in a majority Shia country.
Exactly. So the question becomes, what does a leader like that do when he feels his throne is genuinely threatened by an outside force and ideology?
Well, what he did was invade Iran in 1980, kicked off an 8-year war. And interestingly, he had backing from the U.S. and some Arab monarchies initially, but the war just became this horrific stalemate. Hundreds of thousands died. Khomeini wouldn't accept any ceasefire, wanted Saddam gone.
Iranian forces even pushed into Iraq at points, hitting Iraq's oil exports hard.
So Saddam gets desperate. He borrows billions, huge amounts, from Saudi Arabia and Kuwait to keep the war going.
Which sets up a future problem, doesn't it? What happens when you owe that kind of money and, well, maybe you don't intend to pay it back?
And it shows how ruthless he was even during the war. There's this chilling story. Iraq's health minister apparently suggested maybe Saddam should resign to end the war.
A brave suggestion. Or perhaps foolish.
Extremely foolish, it turned out. Saddam reportedly dragged the minister into another room and just shot him. Personally.
Wow. Just like that. No room for dissent, not at all.
None. So the war finally ends in 1988. No winner, maybe 1 million dead. Iraq's economy totally shattered.
But Saddam's defiance, it seems like it only grew stronger somehow.
Okay, so fast forward to 1990. Saddam's got these massive war debts. His pride is wounded from the stalemate with Iran. And then Kuwait, his tiny oil-rich neighbor that he owes money to, starts demanding repayment. Plus, they're flooding the oil market, crashing prices, which hurts Iraq even more.
A perfect storm of financial pressure and wounded ego.
Exactly. So what does he do? He invades Kuwait. Overruns the country in just 2 days. Most of the Kuwaiti royals fled. But one prince, Fahad, apparently stood his ground. And the story is just brutal. Iraqi troops shot him, then ran tanks over his body.
Calculated terror.
Yeah. Was it strength? Was it just madness? It was definitely designed to send a message.
And he immediately tries to make it permanent, right? Declares Kuwait the 19th province of Iraq. He is arguably the most feared leader in the Arab world at this point. But he seems to have totally misread the global reaction, especially the U.S. There's an interesting perspective in some sources suggesting the U.S., while maybe looking neutral, might have lured him into a trap, whether intentionally or not.
How so?
Well, America quickly builds this big coalition, including Arab nations. They warn everyone. Saudi Arabia is next. Maybe even using some questionable intelligence like fake images of Iraqi tanks massing.
Okay, so drumming up fear to justify intervention.
Possibly. And the response was swift. The U.S.-led coalition attacks in 1991. Kuwait's liberated in about a month. A decisive defeat for Saddam.
But even as his army is retreating, fleeing Kuwait, Saddam pulls off one last act of defiance, something that really resonated with some people in the Arab world. He fires missiles into Israel.
Right, a symbolic act, hitting a common enemy for many in the region.
Exactly. And strangely, or maybe not so strangely, that act won him some admiration. People saw it as him standing up to the West, to Israel. Which makes you think, doesn't it? Can one act of defiance like that actually change how people see a tyrant? Maybe paint him as a hero, even temporarily.
It's complex, and that defeat in Kuwait, it didn't break him. If anything, the sources suggest he kind of doubled down. He started embracing Islam much more publicly, banned alcohol, made Quran studies mandatory. There was even that really bizarre, controversial story about him commissioning a Quran written in his own blood.
Right, I remember hearing about that. Was it genuine faith? A political move, trying to rally support against sanctions?
Hard to say for sure. Probably a mix. Meanwhile, those UN sanctions were absolutely crippling Iraq's economy. People were suffering terribly, starving. And then comes this huge betrayal. 2 of his top generals, who also happen to be his sons-in-law, they flee Iraq. They go public, calling Saddam a tyrant, even claiming he had plans for nuclear weapons.
Wow. Betrayal by family. Does anything sting more when you're trying to hold on to power?
It must have been devastating. But Saddam's response was typically Saddam.
He lured them back, didn't he? With promises of forgiveness.
Exactly, solemn promises. But just hours after they returned, his son, Uday killed them.
Uday. He had a reputation for being particularly brutal, right? even by Saddam's standards.
Oh, absolutely. Infamous for cruelty. Kidnapping, torture, executions. He was Saddam's enforcer in many ways.
Which raises a really dark question.
Oh.
How do you, as a father, deal with that? Loving your son, perhaps, but also knowing, maybe even fearing, what he's capable of.
A disturbing dynamic, for sure.
Then comes 2001, the 9/11 attacks in the U.S. And even though there was no real evidence linking Saddam to al-Qaeda or the attacks,
No credible link established.
the U.S. administration starts building a case against him anyway, focusing on the idea that he had weapons of mass destruction, WMDs.
Right. That became the primary justification.
Which leads you to ask, why launch a massive war based on, well, what turned out to be false pretenses?
A question historians still debate intensely.
So the U.S. invades Iraq in 2003. The invasion is quick. Baghdad falls. Saddam and his sons, Uday and Qasem, they go into hiding.
And then another betrayal. Someone informs on the son's location for a huge reward, apparently $30 million.
$30 million. Wow. And they die fighting, right, in a firefight with U.S. forces.
They do. But there's another detail from the sources here, really striking. Saddam's young grandson, Mustafa, just a boy, he was with them.
Yeah.
And he reportedly kept firing at the U.S. troops with a rifle until he was killed, too.
A child. That kind of defiance. What does that say about the legacy, the loyalty, maybe the indoctrination that Saddam inspired, even in a kid?
It's quite something. And then Saddam himself is captured. The contrast is just stark. Found hiding in this tiny underground hole, a spider hole, a pretty undignified end for a man used to palaces. But even then, in court, stripped of everything, he was defiant.
Yeah, I remember seeing clips mocking the judges, calling them American puppets.
Absolutely, still projecting that presence, that defiance, even with nothing left. How does someone do that?
He's sentenced to death in 2006, and his last words reportedly were shouts for Palestine against America.
He wanted to be executed by firing squad, like a soldier. They denied him that.
Right. He was hanged instead, December 30, 2006, and they broadcast it to the world. A very public, brutal end. And here's the really grim irony, isn't it? America, the coalition, and they thought removing Saddam would bring peace, stability to Iraq.
That was the hope, or at least the stated goal.
But it did the opposite. The invasion unleashed absolute chaos, terrible sectarian violence, Shia versus Sunni, millions displaced. And then, from the ashes of Saddam's disbanded army, you get the rise of ISIS. A new kind of horror.
A direct, catastrophic consequence.
So it leaves you with this awful question. Did America destroy a tyrant, only to maybe inadvertently create something even worse, a failed state, a breeding ground for extremism?
It's the core question about the legacy. Even today, his image is so contested in Iraq. Some still see him as a hero, maybe misguided, but someone who stood up to the West, who built things.
While others, probably the majority, remember him simply as a butcher, responsible for torture, mass graves, endless suffering.
Exactly. It's the ultimate paradox. Rags to riches, power to ruin, fear and defiance, all wrapped up in one figure. His story really forces us to confront some uncomfortable truths about power, leadership, and the consequences.
It really does. It makes you ask, what is the actual cost of that kind of power? And in the end, who really pays the price? Something definitely to think about. The complexities of Saddam Hussein and the long, long shadow his life and death continue to cast.